The stasis pod cracked open with a sound like ice splitting, and Vorith gasped awake into cold air that tasted wrong. His four-fingered hands slammed against the pod's interior walls on reflex, claws scraping against the resin lining as the hibernation fluid drained from his lungs in a series of burning, choking coughs. The overhead lights were cycling at half power. Emergency amber. The pod's readout display flickered with corrupted symbols he could not parse through the blur of reawakening. Something had gone wrong with the transit. He forced himself upright. The hibernation bay was intact, rows of pods stretching along the curved bulkhead, each one sealed and dark except his. The ship's secondary hum was present, which meant the reactor was cycling. The ventilation system pushed recycled air across his face, but the primary navigation tone, the constant low pulse that every Verath crew member learned to sleep through, was silent. That tone only stopped when the ship had arrived at its destination, or when the navigation array had failed entirely. Vorith pulled himself out of the pod, his digitigrade legs nearly buckling under his own weight. Hibernation atrophy. He had been under for a long time. His joints ached in the particular way they did after extended stasis, not the dull stiffness of a short sleep, but the deep, grinding protest of muscles that had not fired in millennia. His chronogland, the organ behind his left ear that every Verath used to track elapsed time by hormonal shifts, was pulsing with a reading he could not accept. 60,000 years. That was not possible. The mission profile for the return trip to Sol 3 was 1,100 years of transit. 60,000 was a malfunction. Had to be. He checked the reading again. Pressed the gland with 2 fingers, the way the ship's medic had taught him during pre-flight briefing. Apply pressure, wait for the hormonal pulse to reset, read again. The reading did not change. 60,000 years plus or minus 400. His body knew how long it had been asleep even if his mind refused to accept the number. The hibernation bay smelled wrong. Not the acrid chemical scent of hibernation fluid that was normal, expected. Underneath it was something older, fainter. The smell of a ship that had been running on automated systems for far longer than any ship was designed to run. Lubricant that had cycled through the same filters until its molecular structure had begun to degrade. Recycled air that carried trace compounds from 60 millennia of slow outgassing from the hull's interior coatings. The reclaimer smelled like a tomb that had kept its occupants alive by accident. He crossed the hibernation bay on unsteady legs and reached the command gallery. The door irised open at his approach, recognizing his biosignature. Beyond, the gallery was dark except for the forward viewport, which showed a field of stars he did not immediately recognize. The star patterns were wrong. Not dramatically wrong, the constellations were distorted versions of familiar shapes, as if someone had taken the sky he knew and stretched it in all directions. Stellar drift. The kind of drift that only accumulated over tens of thousands of years. His chronogland was not malfunctioning. Vorith braced himself on the navigation console and pulled up the mission log. The display was sluggish, the ship's processing cores running at minimal capacity, but the data populated line by line. The reclaimer had launched from the Verath homeworld of Thural 61,400 years ago, carrying a complement of 800 warriors, technicians, and surveyors on a mandate from the High Synod to return to Sol 3, the third planet in a minor system at the edge of the Orion Arm, and reclaim the biological monitoring stations the Verath had seeded there during their first survey. That first survey had been routine. Sol 3 was a high-gravity world with a corrosive oxygen atmosphere, volatile weather systems, and a biosphere dominated by short-lived carbon organisms locked in perpetual predator-prey cycles. The dominant species at the time of the survey, bipedal, soft-skinned, tool-using but pre-industrial, had been classified as Category 4, intelligent enough to warrant non-interference tagging, but too primitive to pose any obstacle to the monitoring stations embedded in their ocean floors and mountain ranges. The Varath had planted their stations, recorded their data, filed their classification report, and left. Standard procedure for a Category 4 world. Come back in 50,000 years and check whether the species had advanced to Category 5, early industrial, basic metallurgy, rudimentary communication networks, or gone extinct, which was the statistically more likely outcome for high-gravity death-world organisms burning through resources at the rate Sol-3's dominant species consumed them. Vorith had been the mission's lead scout. He had walked the surface of Sol-3 himself, 61,000 years ago, wearing a pressure suit rated for the crushing gravity, breathing filtered air to protect his lungs from the corrosive atmosphere. He remembered the planet clearly. Vast oceans, sprawling landmasses covered in unmanaged vegetation. The dominant species clustered in primitive settlements along river systems, burning wood for heat, shaping soft metals into crude implements. He had observed them from a ridge above one of their larger settlements, a collection of stone and timber structures housing perhaps 10,000 individuals, and noted in his survey report that they displayed rudimentary social organization, basic agricultural practices, and an apparent capacity for symbolic communication through carved markings on stone. His assessment, Category 4, minimal threat, recommends standard monitoring protocol, return in 50,000 years. The High Synod had approved his report without comment. Now he was back. 60,000 years late, due to a navigational error, the mission log attributed to a relay malfunction that had routed the reclaimer through a collapsed transit corridor, adding 50,000 years to the journey. The crew had slept through the entire detour. The ship's automated systems had maintained the hibernation pods, corrected course when the relay failure was detected, and continued toward Sol-3 on sublight drives for the remainder of the transit. 50,000 years of drift, all 800 crew in stasis, and now the ship was here. Vorith activated the forward sensors. The display took a long time to resolve. The sensor arrays had degraded during the extended transit, their calibration drifting beyond standard parameters. When the image finally stabilized, he was looking at a star, yellow, G-type, the right spectral signature. So, he adjusted the scan toward the third orbital position. The planet should have been easy to find, a blue-green sphere, moderately sized, nothing remarkable. His fingers worked the controls from memory, and the sensor array focused. The display went white. Not blank, white. The sensor array was receiving so much data from the third orbital position that the processing cores could not render it into a coherent image. Every frequency was saturated. Electromagnetic emissions across the entire detectable spectrum, layered and dense, radiating outward from Sol-3 like heat from a furnace. The passive scanners were designed to detect the faint electromagnetic signatures of natural planetary bodies, geological processes, atmospheric weather patterns, the dim infrared glow of a world warmed by its star. What they were receiving from Sol-3 was not natural. It was structured, organized, intentional, and it was orders of magnitude louder than anything the sensors were built to process. Vorith recalibrated the array, narrowing the focus, filtering out the lower frequencies. The image resolved in stages, each one worse than the last. Sol-3 was there. The right size, the right orbital position, the right axial tilt, but it was surrounded. A shell of structures orbited the planet at multiple altitudes, dense, continuous, overlapping. Defense platforms, communication arrays, shipyard frameworks, energy collection lattices, transit corridors linking orbital stations to surface installations. The structures were enormous. Some of them were larger than the reclaimer. Some were larger than anything the Varath had ever built. And between the orbital structures, moving in coordinated patterns that the sensors could barely track, were ships. The first ones he identified were the smallest patrol craft, perhaps, moving in pairs along predetermined corridors between the orbital installations. Then he saw the medium-class vessels, each one the size of a Varath destroyer, holding station at equidistant points around the planet's equator. And beyond those, in the deep orbital lanes where the planet's gravity well flattened into interplanetary space, were the capital ships. Voreth counted 12 before the tracking algorithm failed. Each vessel was between 5 and 15 kilometers in length. Their hulls were dense with weapons emplacements, sensor blisters, and launch bays. They moved with the precise, unhurried coordination of a military force on routine patrol, not scrambling, not reacting, patrolling, as if this were an ordinary day, as if fleets of warships the size of small moons orbiting a world was simply what happened here. He felt his secondary heart begin to beat, the stress response. His species had evolved for moments of extreme danger. Both hearts pounding in tandem, flooding his blood with combat hormones, his vision sharpening, his hearing extending into the ultrasonic range. Every instinct told him the same thing. Leave now, before they notice you. But the Reclaimer was not a warship. It was a survey vessel with light defensive armament and sublight drives that could not outrun a cargo hauler. If whatever was down there had already detected them, and given the sophistication of the orbital infrastructure, they almost certainly had running would accomplish nothing except confirming that the Reclaimer was afraid. Voreth began waking the crew. He moved through the hibernation bay with the mechanical precision of training, initiating wake sequences on the priority pods, the ones marked with red bands indicating essential personnel. Each pod hissed and cracked as the seals released, each occupant gasping through the same choking, drowning process of expelling hibernation fluid from lungs that had not drawn breath in 60,000 years. The bay filled with the sounds of retching, coughing, and the low groans of bodies remembering how to move. The first to emerge was Thenic, his second officer. Thenic was old for a Varath. His scales had begun to dull even before the transit, and now they were the color of ash. He pulled himself from his pod with a grunt, shook the hibernation fluid from his crest, and blinked at the emergency lighting. "Report," he said, the word rasping through a throat that had not spoken in 60 millennia. "We overshot the transit window by approximately 50,000 years, Voreth said. "Relay malfunction. The ship corrected and brought us to Sol 3 on sublight." Thenic processed this. Sol 3, the Category 4 world. That classification may require revision. Voreth led him to the command gallery and showed him the sensor data. Thenic studied the orbital infrastructure, the fleet deployments, the electromagnetic saturation. His crest flattened against his skull, the Varath equivalent of a human's blood draining from their face. "This is a mistake," Thenic said. "The sensors have degraded. This data is corrupted." "I recalibrated twice. The data is clean." "Then we are not at Sol 3. We have arrived at a different system. The stellar coordinates match. The planetary mass matches. The axial tilt matches. The atmospheric composition matches oxygen-nitrogen, same ratio within 0.2%. This is Sol 3. Thenic stared at the display. The species was Category 4, stone tools, agricultural settlements. They could not have built this. "Not in 1100 years, no, but we have been in transit for 60,000. The number landed on Thenic the way it had landed on Voreth, like a blow to the sternum. 60,000 years. Long enough for a species to rise from agricultural settlements to whatever this was. Long enough for the soft-skinned bipeds he had observed from a ridge to build warships that dwarfed Varath capital ships. If they had survived, if they had not been replaced, if this was still them. Within the hour, Voreth had 40 crew members awake and operational. He woke only the essential personnel: scouts, sensor technicians, the defensive systems officer, the diplomatic liaison. The rest he left in stasis. No point waking 800 people into a situation he did not yet understand. The sensor technicians confirmed what Vorth already knew. Sol 3 was enveloped in a defense architecture that exceeded anything in the Verath military database. The orbital platforms alone carried enough visible armament to reduce a fleet to vapor. The warships on patrol were operating in overlapping coverage patterns that left no approach vector unmonitored. And beneath the orbital shell, on the planet's surface, the technicians detected something that made the room go quiet. Cities, continent-spanning cities. Not the sprawling, chaotic urban landscapes that primitive industrial civilizations produced. These were engineered environments, their layouts following mathematical patterns visible from orbit. Energy signatures radiated from the population centers in clean, efficient waves. Transit networks connected them like neural pathways. Agricultural zones surrounded the urban cores in precise geometric arrangements, and beyond the agricultural zones, vast tracts of managed wilderness stretched to the coasts. The planet was not just inhabited, it was cultivated, optimized. Every square kilometer of surface appeared to serve a purpose, and every purpose appeared to be in service of a civilization that had moved beyond the question of survival and into the question of what to do with the millennia after survival was guaranteed. Population estimate, Vorth asked. The lead technician hesitated. The sensor resolution is insufficient for an accurate count, but based on energy consumption patterns and urban density modeling, the surface population appears to be in excess of 40 billion. 40 billion! On a world that had held perhaps 200 million when the Verath last visited. And the orbital installations. Unknown. The electromagnetic interference makes accurate scanning of the orbital band difficult, but structural analysis suggests habitable volume sufficient for an additional 3 to 5 billion. Warship count. We have confirmed 67 vessels in the patrol formation visible from our current position. Based on shipyard capacity and docking infrastructure, estimated total fleet strength exceeds the reclaimer's computational ceiling. Thennick's voice was low. Define exceeds the ceiling. The number is very large, second officer. I cannot give you a figure because our system does not have enough digits allocated for fleet strength variables of this magnitude. Vorth turned to the viewport. Sol 3 hung before them, blue, green, white, wrapped in its crown of orbital steel, warships moving through the defense grid like blood cells through veins. Beautiful, terrifying, utterly unrecognizable. They were supposed to be primitives, Thennick said quietly, standing beside him. They were primitives, 60,000 years ago. And now? Vorth did not answer. He did not have a category for what Sol 3 had become. The defensive systems officer, Karath, approached from the weapons console. She was compact even by Verath standards, her scales a dark bronze, her movements economical. Commander. You should see this. She brought up a secondary sensor overlay. The reclaimer's hull had been scanned not by the ship's own systems but by an external source. The scan had been invisible to their sensor suite. They only knew it had happened because the hull's passive detection layer, a thin film of reactive alloy designed to register contact with directed energy, was showing a pattern. The pattern covered every centimeter of the hull. Every system, every compartment, every sealed pod, every weapon mount. Someone had read the reclaimer the way a librarian reads a shelf thoroughly, systematically, without moving a single book out of place. When did this happen? Vorth asked. Based on the film's decay rate, approximately 7 hours ago. While you were still in stasis. 7 hours. They had been scanned while he was asleep before he had even known they had arrived. Whatever was down there had reached out, touched his ship from stem to stern, learned everything about it and withdrawn without triggering a single alarm. They knew the layout of every compartment. They knew the yield of every weapon. They knew how many crew were aboard, how many were awake, and how many were still in stasis. They knew the structural tolerances of the hull, the frequency ranges of the sensor array, and the reaction time of the defensive systems. They knew the reclaimer better than Vorth did. "There is more," Kareth said. She adjusted the display. The outer defense perimeter, the ring of orbital platforms at the system's edge had shifted. 3 platforms had repositioned themselves along the reclaimer's approach vector, not aggressively. The weapons emplacements on each platform were oriented outward, toward deep space, not toward the reclaimer. The platforms had moved to cover the reclaimer's flanks. They were not targeting the survey vessel, they were protecting it. They passed the 4th planet, the one the survey records had designated Sol 4, a cold, barren rock with a thin atmosphere of carbon dioxide. Vorth had not bothered surveying it 60,000 years ago. No biosphere, no strategic value, nothing worth a footnote. Sol 4 was green. Not entirely, the southern hemisphere was still rust-colored, still scarred with the deep canyons and impact basins he remembered from the survey charts. But the northern hemisphere was covered in vegetation. Rivers ran through engineered channels. Clouds gathered above the equator. And on the planet's largest volcanic structure, a shield formation that had once been the tallest dead mountain in the system, Vorth could see the lights of a city. "Commander," the lead sensor technician said, "population estimate for Sol 4, 17 billion. 17 billion on a world that had been a dead rock 60,000 years ago. They had not merely built on their own planet. They had built others." Thennick made a sound that was half word, half exhalation. "How many worlds in this system have they?" "Every rocky body in the inner system shows signs of habitation or industrial modification," the technician said. "The gas giant moons have been restructured. 2 appear to have been moved to new orbits. The asteroid belt has been replaced by a continuous ring of orbital foundries. Based on energy output signatures, the foundries appear to be manufacturing hull plating, weapons components, and propulsion systems at a rate I cannot calculate with our available processing power." "Replace the asteroid belt," Thennick repeated. "Used it," Kareth corrected. "They consumed the raw material of the asteroid belt and rebuilt it into infrastructure. Every rock, every mineral deposit, every fragment of orbital debris, all of it processed, refined, and assembled into shipyard modules. There is nothing left of the original belt. They ate it." Vorth stared at the sensor overlay. The Sol system he remembered from the original survey, a quiet, unremarkable collection of planets orbiting a middle-aged star, was gone. In its place was a machine, an organism, a civilization that had consumed the raw materials of its home system and rebuilt them into the architecture of a species that intended to endure forever. Every planet modified, every moon repurposed, every asteroid processed. The system itself had become a tool, wielded by 40-odd billion hands over 60,000 years, and it was still being refined. They passed a shipyard complex in the orbital band. It was vast, a framework of construction cradles, each one holding the skeleton of a warship in various stages of completion. Workers moved across the frameworks in suits that glowed with faint illumination, welding, fitting, assembling. Automated systems carried hull plates along magnetic rails. The shipyard was building 7 vessels simultaneously, each one larger than the reclaimer. And through the shipyard's transparent sections, Vorth could see more shipyards behind it, receding into the orbital distance, each one building more. "They are not maintaining a fleet," Thennick said. "They are growing one continuously, without urgency. The way a forest grows." Shorth had been quiet since the approach began, studying the data feeds with the trained detachment of a diplomat assessing a negotiating partner's position. Now she spoke. "Commander, I have been monitoring their communication traffic. The signals are encrypted, but the volume and routing patterns are analyzable. And the communication network extends beyond the Sol system. Significantly, I am detecting relay nodes at interstellar distances. The nearest appears to be approximately 4 light-years from Sol, positioned near the closest neighboring star. Others extend in multiple directions. The network geometry suggests active communication with at least 900 distinct nodes. 900. The Varath Synod controlled 47 systems. These primitives were communicating with 900. The implications are clear, Shurth said, her voice carefully neutral. This is not a single system civilization. This is an interstellar power of considerable scale. Our diplomatic approach will need to account for the possibility that we are dealing with a species that has expanded far beyond anything in our contact database. A tone sounded on the communications console, not from the reclaimer's systems from outside. A signal, directed at the reclaimer, originating from one of the orbital platforms. Clean, precise, modulated on a frequency the Varath used for diplomatic channels. Someone on that platform knew the Varath communication protocols. The diplomatic liaison took the console. The signal resolved into audio, a voice. Speaking Varath. Not perfectly. The accent was wrong, the consonants too hard, the tonal shift slightly off-pitch, as if the speaker had learned the language from recordings rather than from living speakers. But the grammar was correct. The vocabulary was current. Someone on Sol 3 had learned to speak Varath, and they were using it now. Vessel of the Varath Synod, the voice said. You have entered monitored space. Identify your designation and purpose. Shurth looked at Vorith. He nodded. This is the Survey Vessel Reclaimer, registered to the Varath High Synod, Commander Vorith presiding. We are on a scheduled return mission to Sol 3 for the purpose of servicing biological monitoring stations installed during a prior survey. We arrive with no hostile intent. The silence lasted 12 seconds. Vorith counted each one. Reclaimer, stand by. The channel went quiet. Vorith watched the sensor display. Nothing changed in the patrol formation. No ships broke from their pattern. No weapons systems activated. The orbital defense platforms remained on their steady rotation. Whatever response the Reclaimer's presence had triggered, it had not triggered alarm. It had triggered procedure. That frightened Vorith more than alarm would have. Alarm meant surprise. Procedure meant they had done this before. Procedure meant they had a protocol for dealing with unannounced Varath vessels arriving in their space, which meant they had thought about this scenario, prepared for it, and reduced it to a checklist. 4 minutes later, the channel reopened. Reclaimer, this is Earth Orbital Authority, Sentinel Station 9. Your vessel registry has been located in our historical database. Your mission profile has been identified. You are cleared for a supervised approach to Orbital Reception Platform 7, transmitting approach vector now. Escort craft will intercept at marker Delta 4. Comply with escort instructions. Do not deviate from the assigned vector. Do not activate weapons or defensive systems. The approach vector appeared on the navigation console. A clean line from their current position to a platform on the daylight side of the planet, threading through the orbital infrastructure with precise margins. Fennec leaned close. They found our registry in a historical database. They know who we are. They knew we might come, Vorith said, and they prepared for it. The difference does not comfort me. Vorith engaged the approach vector. The Reclaimer moved forward on maneuvering thrusters. Up close, the orbital platforms were staggering. Each one was a fortress, kilometers of armored hull studded with sensor arrays and weapons blisters, their surfaces scarred by micrometeorite impacts that had been repaired so many times the hull plating had the layered texture of tree bark. These platforms were not new. They had been here for a very long time. And they had been maintained with the obsessive attention of a species that believed in upkeep the way the Varath believed in hierarchy. Kareth ran a passive scan on the nearest platform as they passed. Her console chimed with results and her crest went rigid. Commander, the weapons on that platform are not energy-based. They appear to operate on a principle I cannot identify. The emitter arrays are drawing from a power source that is not fusion, not antimatter, and not any form of stored energy I have in my reference database. The energy signature is folded, layered. Is that possible? It was not the last time I checked, but I checked 60,000 years ago. The escort craft arrived. 2 of them, emerging from the orbital traffic like predators detaching from a reef. Small, fast, their hulls a dark matte gray that absorbed sensor returns so completely that the reclaimer's tracking systems lost lock on them 3 times during the approach. They took positions on either side of the reclaimer and matched speed without communication, no signal, no handshake, no coordination protocol. They simply fell into formation as if they had been flying escort on Varath, survey vessels their entire careers. Kareth ran a passive scan on the nearest escort craft. Commander, those hulls are not alloy. I do not know what they are. The molecular structure does not correspond to any material in the Varath metallurgical database. It appears to be grown rather than forged. Through the lateral viewport, Vorith could see the nearest escort pilot. The silhouette was unmistakable. Bipedal upright, 2 arms. The proportions of the species he had observed from a ridge 60,000 years ago, the same basic body plan, unmistakably the same organism. But the pilot moved inside the cockpit with a fluid confidence that had nothing primitive about it. The flight suit shifted colors as the pilot adjusted controls. The craft responded to inputs so slight that the pilot's hands barely moved. The technology was not bolted onto the species. It was woven into them. The approach took 20 minutes. As they drew closer to the reception platform, more details resolved. The platform was large enough to dock a vessel 10 times the reclaimer's size. Workers moved along the platform's exterior surfaces, performing maintenance. They did not look up as the reclaimer passed. A Varath survey vessel docking at their orbital platform was, apparently, not worth looking up from their work for. The reclaimer settled into the assigned cradle with a magnetic clamp that locked the hull into place with a precision that made Vorith's own docking systems feel crude. The cradle itself was not standard. It had adjusted its geometry as the reclaimer approached, reshaping its grip points to match the survey vessel's hull configuration. The platform had scanned the reclaimer's exterior dimensions and manufactured a custom docking cradle in the time it took to complete the final approach. A pressurized umbilical extended from the platform to the reclaimer's ventral airlock. Atmosphere readings appeared on Vorith's console. The umbilical was filled with breathable air, but not the Sol 3 standard. The oxygen content had been reduced and the pressure lowered. They had adjusted the atmosphere in the umbilical to match Varath respiratory tolerances. They knew the Varath could not breathe their air without assistance, and they had prepared for it. Vorith selected a contact team. Himself, Thenic, Shurth, and 4 scouts in light armor. He considered full combat kit, then reconsidered. Any weapon the reclaimer carried would be irrelevant against a civilization that patrolled its homeworld with warships the size of mountains. The airlock cycled. The umbilical beyond was well lit, wide enough for 3 Varath abreast. They walked in silence. Vorith's secondary heart was still pounding, but he controlled his breathing, kept his crest neutral, his stride measured. He was a scout. Scouts observed. They did not flinch. The umbilical ended at a pressure door that opened onto a reception chamber. The chamber was large, open, with a high ceiling and wide viewports overlooking the planet below. The lighting was warm, not the harsh white of Varath installations, but a golden tone that fell somewhere between sunlight and firelight. The floor was stone. Actual stone, cut and polished, not composite or alloy. As if someone had decided that the first surface a visitor stepped onto should feel like a world, not a station. 3 figures stood at the center of the chamber, waiting. They were tall. Taller than Vorith, which was unusual. The species he remembered from the survey had been shorter than the Varath. These individuals were taller, leaner, with an upright carriage that suggested thousands of years of adaptation. Their clothing was simple dark tunics with minimal ornamentation, each bearing a single emblem on the collar. The one in the center stepped forward. A male, broad-shouldered, with close-cropped gray hair and eyes the color of weathered stone. He looked at Vorith the way a structural engineer looks at a bridge assessing load-bearing capacity. "Commander Vorith," the male said. He spoke Varath, the same imperfect accent. "I am Director Callum Osai of the Contact Authority. Welcome to Earth." The word hit Vorith like a slap. Earth. Not Sol 3. The planet's own name, spoken in the Varath tongue, carrying the weight of a species that had earned the right to name their own world and expected others to use it. "Director Osai, thank you for receiving us. We acknowledge that our arrival is unannounced. Our transit encountered a relay malfunction that extended our journey significantly by approximately 50,000 years, according to our analysis of your vessel's drive signature. We detected your approach 9 days ago when your sublight engines crossed the heliopause sensor line. Your ship's registry was matched within 4 minutes. 9 days. They had known the reclaimer was coming for 9 days. They had prepared a reception chamber with adjusted atmosphere and a diplomat who spoke Varath. "You have our registry in your database," Vorith said carefully. "We have extensive records of Varath activity in the Sol system. Your species conducted a survey of this planet approximately 61,000 years ago. You installed 47 biological monitoring stations on the ocean floor and in the Himalayan and Andean mountain ranges. You classified the dominant species as Category 4 and filed a report recommending standard monitoring protocol with a return date of 50,000 years. Vorith felt a cold sensation spread through his chest. "You found the monitoring stations." "We found the first one in 2847 CE, roughly 12,000 years after your survey. It was embedded in the floor of the Pacific Ocean at a depth of 6,000 meters. It took approximately 400 years to fully decode the technology and another 200 to extract the data stored in its memory cores." Osai paused. Something shifted behind his eyes, a controlled hardness, the look of a man delivering facts that carried the weight of a very old grievance. "The data included your survey report, Commander, your classification of our species, your assessment of our technological capability, your recommendation that we be left under observation, like specimens in a laboratory, while your synod decided whether we were worth returning to." The chamber was very quiet. Vorith could hear his own heart's beating. Fennec stood motionless behind him, crest flat. "That was standard procedure," Vorith said. "Category 4 civilizations are observed, not contacted. The non-interference protocol exists to protect developing species from." "From what?" Osai said. The word was not sharp. It was patient. The patience of a species that had spent 60,000 years composing its answer and was not in a hurry to finish delivering it. Vorith did not respond. Osai turned to the viewports. Beyond the glass, Earth curved below them. One of the warships was passing directly below the station. Its shadow fell across a continent, a dark line that swept across cities and coastlines before vanishing over the horizon. "You left 47 monitoring stations on our world, hidden, undisclosed, planted without our knowledge or consent, by a species that had decided we were too primitive to warrant communication. You observed us the way a researcher observes organisms in a controlled environment. And then you left, confident that we would either evolve on your schedule or die on your planet." He turned back to Vorith. "We did neither." The second figure, a woman with dark hair and the bearing of someone accustomed to command, spoke. "Director, the commander should see the archive before we continue." They followed Osai through corridors that felt less like a space station and more like a city district compressed into orbital form. The walls were lined with materials Vorth could not identify, not metal, not composite, not stone, but something that seemed to shift between states depending on the angle. Light came from the walls themselves, warm and diffuse. People passed in both directions, none of them paying more than a glance to the Verath delegation. A technician carrying equipment nodded to Osai and kept walking. Two officers in dark uniforms stepped aside to let the group pass, then resumed their conversation without looking back. A child stopped and stared openly, eyes wide with curiosity rather than fear, before being guided onward by a parent who murmured something that made the child laugh. The informality was unsettling. In Verath stations, a commander's passage required formal acknowledgement. Crew members pressed to the bulkhead, eyes forward, until the officer had passed. Here, the director of the contact authority moved through the population like a current through water, not because they did not respect him, because they were so secure in their civilization's strength that ceremony had become optional. They entered a chamber Vorth understood immediately was significant. The room was circular, with walls of dark polished material. Covering every surface in characters that glowed with steady warm light were lines of text. Not Verath, human script, tens of thousands of lines spiraling from floor to ceiling. The contact archive, Osai said. A record of every extraterrestrial interaction Earth has experienced, from the discovery of your first monitoring station to the present day. He gestured to a section near the floor. The Verath survey, 61,000 years ago. Vorth looked at the entry. Beside each line was a translation in Verath, rendered accurately, with proper tonal marks. They had translated their own history into the language of the species that had dismissed them. Osai pointed to a single line, set apart, translated into both scripts. Assessment by VRATH Lead Scout VORETH, Survey Cycle 9114, Dominant Species Classification Category 4, Minimal Threat, Recommend Standard Monitoring Protocol, Return in 50,000 years. Vorth read his own words. His own assessment, carved into the wall of an orbital station built by the species he had dismissed. He felt his claws extend involuntarily. "You kept my name," he said. "We kept everything. Your name, your survey number, the atmospheric readings your suit took, the bootprints your team left at the Himalayan station site. We preserved them under transparent shields. They are part of the geological record now, sandstone casts of alien footprints on a mountain that has eroded 300 meters since you stood on it." Why? Because memory is how we build. The discovery of your monitoring stations was one of the defining moments in our history. It told us two things. First, that we were not alone. Second, that the species who knew we existed had looked at us, decided we were not worth speaking to, and walked away. That knowledge, Osai said, did more to shape what we became than any other single factor, not because it made us angry, though it did, not because it made us afraid, though it did that too, because it made us understand that the universe does not wait for you to be ready. It comes when it comes, and when it came for us, we decided we would be ready. He led them to the far wall. Here, the records changed. Not historical projections, scenarios, response protocols, contact scenarios for 31 known extraterrestrial species, fleet deployment protocols for 14 threat classifications, diplomatic frameworks for every contact type, evacuation procedures for every installation type. "How many other species have come here?" Vorth asked. 47 have entered the Sol system since your survey. Each one has a file containing their complete interaction history, known capabilities, communication protocols, and a response framework maintained by the Council of Preparedness. And the Verath file, among the most detailed, drafted 48,000 years ago when we first decoded your monitoring stations, revised continuously since. It includes projections of Verath fleet capabilities at various technological stages, estimated transit times from Thural, probable mission profiles for a return expedition, and recommended diplomatic approaches calibrated to Verath's social hierarchy and honor protocols. 48,000 years of preparation for this conversation. Your military capability assessment of the Verath Synod, Vorth said. What does it say? That the Synod's peak fleet strength would be insufficient to penetrate the outer defense perimeter of the Sol system. That a full-scale Verath military expedition, including reserve forces, would represent a manageable threat requiring activation of approximately 4% of Earth's standing defense capacity. 4%. Vorth heard Thennick make a low, involuntary exhalation. The scouts behind them shifted their weight but did not speak. Our mission mandate was to service the monitoring stations, Vorth said. I assume those stations are no longer operational. They were deactivated approximately 12,000 years ago. The hardware has been preserved in the Planetary Heritage Archive. The data they collected has been integrated into our biological survey databases. Commander Ayala spoke again. Director, the Outer Perimeter Report. Commander Vorth, 3 hours ago, a Verath communications relay activated in the outer system. A relay your species installed during the original survey, which we have been monitoring since its discovery in 4100 CE. The relay has transmitted a burst signal toward Thural. We believe this is an automated response triggered by the Reclaimer's arrival. You know about the relay. We have known about it for 57,000 years. We have not deactivated it. The Council of Preparedness recommended against it. A signal reaching Thural would prompt a response. A response would provide information about the current state of the Verath Synod. Information is more valuable than secrecy. They had known about the relay for 57,000 years. They had left it active because they wanted the Verath to come, out of the absolute, bone-deep confidence that when the Verath came, Earth would be ready. How long before the signal reaches Thural? Approximately 600 years. Assuming the Synod responds with a fleet, arrival would be in roughly 1,800 years. And you are telling me this because there is no advantage in concealing it. We begin our interactions with transparency. Vorth looked at Thennick. His second officer's crest was pressed flat. The scout's sidearms hung untouched ornaments on soldiers who had realized that armed resistance was theatrical in this context. What will you do when the Synod's fleet arrives? What we always do. We will be here, we will be ready, and we will give them the same choice we are giving you. Which is, acknowledge what you are looking at, understand what it means, and decide whether you want to proceed as an adversary or as a guest. Osei let the silence hold. We have accommodations for both. Ayala activated a display, a real-time surface feed, a coastline, an ocean the color of deep lapis, and along the coast, stretching hundreds of kilometers inland, a city that made every Verath settlement look like a frontier outpost. The organic towers caught the afternoon sun. Parks and waterways filled the spaces between structures, and woven through all of it, disguised in the architecture, embedded in the landscaping, Vorth could see defense systems. Weapons platforms masquerading as observation decks, emitter arrays built into the tower spirals, ground installations along ancient flood barriers, each capable of reaching orbit. The city was a fortress dressed as a garden. The beauty was real, but it was also armor. The Atlantic Reach, Osei said. Population, 600 million, one of 312 primary urban centers on the surface. Vorth stepped toward the archive wall, traced a timeline in smaller script. 2847 CE, first Verath monitoring station discovered. 3247 CE, full decryption of Verath survey data and classification report. 3250 CE, Council of Preparedness established. Primary mandate: ensure Earth is never again assessed as a subordinate species. 3800 CE. Verath communications relay detected. Decision: monitor, do not deactivate. 5200 CE. First interstellar defense platform deployed. 7400 CE. Earth fleet strength exceeds estimated Verath total military capacity. 12,000 CE. Verath monitoring stations deactivated after complete technological surpassing. 15,000 CE. Contact protocol for Verath return expedition formally adopted. 48,000 CE. Contact protocol revised 117th iteration. Current version. 117 revisions, over 48,000 years, for this meeting. You have been preparing for us longer than our civilization has existed in its current form, Vorth said quietly. We have been preparing for everything. Your return is one scenario among thousands, but yes, it is among the oldest. Vorth stepped back from the wall. His species had built an empire on the premise that the universe could be classified. Category 1 through Category 10, each level a rung on a ladder, each species assigned its place. The system was founded on a single assumption, that a species' current state was a reliable predictor of its future. He was looking at the refutation of that assumption, carved into the walls and floating in orbit and patrolling in warships the size of cities. Your species, when I surveyed you, you were building with stone and burning wood. How did you get from there to this? Osai was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice carried a weight that was not personal but civilizational. You said we had no written language. You were wrong. We had symbols carved into stone. Your own survey recorded them. Those symbols became alphabets. Alphabets became literature, mathematics, philosophy, law. You said we had no metallurgy. We had fire and curiosity. Fire and curiosity become metallurgy, then industry, then chemistry, then physics, then engineering beyond anything your classification system has a category for. He took a step closer. You saw what we were in a single moment and extrapolated a single future, but a moment is not a trajectory. A seed is not a verdict. You classified us as primitives. You were not wrong about what we were. You were wrong about what we would become. And the error was not in your instruments. It was in your assumption that what a species is today determines what it will be tomorrow. You measured our tools and extrapolated our ceiling. But tools are not ceilings. They are starting points. He gestured toward the viewport, where the warships continued their patrol. Every one of those vessels was built by descendants of the people you watched building with stone. The same hands, the same curiosity, the same refusal to accept that the world could not be understood and reshaped. You saw that refusal in its infancy and called it primitive. We call it the engine of everything we have become. What category are you now? Vorth asked. We stopped assigning categories a very long time ago. Categories are for species that believe the universe can be sorted into boxes. We learned that the universe does not sort. It flows. The species that endures is not the one at the top of someone else's list. It is the one that never stops building, never stops learning, and never assumes that today's assessment will be true tomorrow. Osa extended his hand, an open palm, facing up, fingers spread. Vorth recognized the gesture. He had seen it 61,000 years ago on the surface of Sol 3, when two of the primitive bipeds had met at a river crossing and greeted each other with exactly this motion. Open palm. No weapon. No threat. The oldest gesture of a species that had carried it forward through 60,000 years of transformation, unchanged. Vorth retracted his claws. He placed his own hand, four-fingered, scaled into the human's palm. Guest, he said, we will proceed as guests. Osai closed his hand gently around Vorth's. The grip was warm, firm, and careful, calibrated to the Verath hand structure, avoiding the sensitive interdigital membranes. because of course they had prepared for this exact handshake. "There is something else I would like you to see," Osa said, "if you are willing." They took a transit pod that descended toward the surface. The pod's interior adjusted as they dropped, the atmospheric composition shifting. Vorth felt the oxygen increase press against his lungs. A breathing mask emerged from a panel beside his seat, and he fitted it over his muzzle without being asked. They had known he would need it, at this exact point in the descent. The pod cleared the cloud layer. He had walked this surface 61,000 years ago. He remembered the dirt, the unmanaged wilderness, the crude settlements, the silence of a world that did not know it was being watched. What he saw now was a civilization that had decided silence was finished. The surface rushed up to meet them. Rivers that had been wild and uncharted were now engineered waterways, their courses optimized but not sterilized. Banks of native vegetation lined the channels, birds wheeled above the water, and the sunlight caught the surface in patterns that were beautiful in a way that was clearly intentional. The wilderness between the urban centers was not abandoned land. It was maintained wilderness, forests managed for biodiversity, grasslands maintained for carbon cycling, coastlines reinforced against erosion with structures that looked like natural rock formations, until you noticed their mathematical regularity. They had not conquered their planet, they had partnered with it. The transit pod landed at the edge of the Atlantic Reach. Vorth stepped into air that was warm and thick and alive with the smell of salt and growing things. The gravity pressed on him immediately, half again what the Varath homeworld exerted. But the path from the landing platform was smooth, the incline gentle, as if the ground itself had been graded to accommodate visitors. Because it had been. The city rose around him. The organic towers caught the afternoon sun. Children played in a garden adjacent to the landing zone. None of them stopped playing when the Varath delegation walked past. A few glanced over with the casual curiosity of children for whom visitors from other worlds were unremarkable. Vorth had walked alien planets and filed reports that determined their fate. He had never felt small. He felt small now. Osai led them to a building at the edge of the city, low, broad, constructed of dark polished material. Above the entrance, carved into the lintel, was a single line in both human script and Varath. "The ridge." Vorth stopped walking. "The ridge above the settlement, where I stood during the original survey. The settlement you observed from that ridge was a farming community called Harappa. It no longer exists. The river shifted 8,000 years after your visit, but the ridge remained. When we reconstructed the locations your team visited, we identified it. We built this site on the exact coordinates where your pressure suit's atmospheric sensors recorded the air composition that went into your report." They had built a memorial on the spot where he had stood and looked down at their ancestors, and decided they were not worth talking to. Inside was a single room. At the center stood a display case of transparent material. Inside, preserved under vacuum, was a single object. A boot print, cast in stone. The three-toed impression of a Varath pressure suit's foot, pressed into what had once been soft earth on a ridgeline above a farming settlement. His boot print. The stone was sandstone, 61,000 years old, every detail intact. The tread pattern, the depth showing a Varath's weight under Sol 3's heavy gravity, the faint drag mark at the heel where he had shifted his weight to get a better view of the settlement below. He remembered that moment. He had shifted his weight because one of the bipeds, a female, carrying an infant, had stopped at the edge of the settlement and looked up at the ridge. For a moment, he had thought she had seen him, but his camouflage field was active, and she had turned away after a few seconds, adjusting the infant on her hip, walking back toward the central structure. He had watched her walk away. She had moved with the unhurried gait of someone who belonged to the land she walked on, who knew the path to the central structure so well that her feet found it without her eyes. The infant on her hip had been reaching for something, a leaf, perhaps, or an insect, with the unfocused fascination of the very young. The female had adjusted her grip without looking, the movement automatic, practiced, the product of thousands of generations of mothers carrying children on the same hip while their free hand worked. He had noted the interaction as evidence of rudimentary threat awareness behavior and moved on. He had not noted the tenderness. He had not noted the competence. He had not noted that a species capable of carrying its young while working, walking, and watching the horizon simultaneously was a species that had already solved the fundamental problem of civilization: how to build the future while surviving the present. "That woman," Vorth said, "the one who looked up at the ridge, do you have any record of her?" Individual records from that era do not survive, but the settlement she lived in is the direct ancestor of the civilization you are standing in. The lineage is unbroken. Every person in this city, every person on this planet, every person in the 900 systems we inhabit can trace their heritage back to communities like hers. Stone tools and river settlements, and a woman carrying a child who looked up at a ridge and sensed something was watching. They were not angry. That was what unsettled Vorth most. The archive was not an accusation. The bootprint was not an exhibit in a trial. These people had not spent 60,000 years nursing a grievance. They had spent 60,000 years building an answer. The answer was not vengeance, not retaliation, not destruction. The answer was the civilization itself. The fleets, the cities, the archives, the defense grid, the 900 systems, the 40 billion lives. The continuous, tireless, patient act of becoming more than anyone had predicted they could be. The answer was readiness. The certainty that they would never again stand on the lower side of a judgment. Vorth turned to Osai. "I will send a full report to the High Synod when the relay signal reaches Thuril. I will recommend that the Verath reclassify this world and formally withdraw the Category 4 designation. That designation was never binding on us. We were never what your Synod said we were." "No, but the Synod should hear it from the scout who made the assessment. The error was mine. The correction should be mine as well." Osai regarded him. The controlled hardness in his expression softened not into warmth exactly, but into something adjacent: respect. The recognition that the Verath standing in front of him, confronted with the evidence of his own species' failure of imagination, was choosing to face it rather than deflect it. "Your report will be received with interest, and when the Synod's fleet arrives in 1800 years, they will find this station waiting, and this archive, and your bootprint in its case, and a civilization that has had 1800 more years to prepare." He paused. "We will still be ready." A silence settled between them, not hostile, not tense. The silence of two species standing at the edge of a conversation that would take centuries to finish, both understanding that the first words had been spoken and could not be taken back. Vorth looked at the bootprint in its case one final time. His own footprint, preserved by a species he had dismissed, maintained for 61,000 years as a reminder not of the insult, but of the moment they had decided to become something no one's classification system could contain. They walked out into the late afternoon light. The city hummed around them, towers catching the sun, transit ribbons carrying silent traffic, the warship patrol visible as distant points of light across the daytime sky. The report Vorth would file, the report that would travel across 600 years of space to reach the High Synod on Thuril, would contain something no Verath survey report had ever contained before. An apology. Not a diplomatic concession, not a strategic repositioning dressed in regretful language. A genuine apology from a scout who had stood on a ridge and looked down at a woman carrying a child and decided, in the space of a single afternoon, that her species had reached its ceiling. He had been trained to assess worlds. He had assessed this one and been wrong by a margin so vast that the error itself had become a monument. Not to the director, not to the contact authority, not to the Council of Preparedness. An apology to the woman who had looked up at the ridge 61,000 years ago, carrying her child, sensing something she could not see, turning away when no answer came. She had deserved an answer. Her descendants had built one not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of the same quiet determination that had carried her child on her hip, while she watched the horizon for threats she could feel but not name. Vorth stood on the surface of Earth, under a sky filled with warships and defense platforms and orbital shipyards, and looked up at the ridge where he had once stood and looked down. The ridge was still there, softened by time and erosion, but recognizable. A ridge where an alien scout had stood and judged a world by what he saw in a single afternoon. The world had spent 60,000 afternoons becoming its own answer. Its cities hummed with the energy of 40 billion lives. Its defense grid held its watch. Its warships moved through their patrols unhurried, confident, patient as stone. Its archives preserved every assessment, every classification, every dismissal, not as grievances but as milestones, markers on the road from stone tools to starships. And in the contact archive on the wall of the orbital station above, 61,000 years of recorded history glowed with a steady, warm light. Each entry a promise kept, each promise proof that the species he had once called primitive had outgrown every category his civilization had ever conceived. The woman on the ridge had looked up. She had sensed something watching, and she had turned away because there was work to do, a child to raise, a settlement to maintain, a future to build one stone at a time. 61,000 years later, her descendants were still building. Not because they were stronger than the Verath. Because they had never stopped becoming what the Verath assumed they could not be.